yet still the war went on. So I'm going to scoot well, I guess they're pretty close here. So what we'd like to do now is take questions on the men that you see before you, the weapons. Do you have any questions? Yes, ma'am. Whose phone's ringing while the... I don't know what you're talking about. What is a phone?
I'm afraid Marine wrong tone as musical taunts. It's a French thing.
So what questions do we have? Do you have any questions about our weapons, our tactics? Yes, sir.
How hot is the uniform?
How hot is the uniform? Actually, today it's quite comfortable. So you have to remember where we came from. So look up the temperature if you can today, what it is in England or France or Belgium, right? So when we came over here, we did modify our uniforms for the weather here. We had done it in the last war. We did it in this war as well. So we modified our hats. We modified our coats. We switched some of our small clothes, which would be our waistcoat and our breeches, to linen instead of wool. And we're feeling just fine.
I have a question. What was your biggest disadvantage being here in the colony?
Biggest disadvantage was just the sheer size of the colony. So in an earlier crowd, somebody asked what was the size of the Crown forces here. General Howe showed up in 1776 off of New York City with an army of about 30,000 men. Sounds pretty big, right? 30,000 men. The biggest army England had ever put across the sea anywhere, right? Some of those soldiers were from where? They weren't all English.
Some of those were German.
German, that's right, because in the previous war, the German principalities had been aligned with the Crown of England. So were they mercenaries? No. They were fighting on behalf of their own princes under their own flags, being paid by their own country. So oftentimes you'll see in history books they'll be referred to as mercenaries. Don't believe it? It's American propaganda.
Fake news.
Fake news. Been going on a long time, folks.
There goes the eagle, though.
Oh, very nice. I hope that's not a sign of things to come.
It's an omen. It's not good for you.
So what other questions do you have? Oh, I guess I didn't fully answer that. So 30,000 men. So could you imagine trying to conquer the entire east coast of this continent with 30,000 men? When they took New York City, at any given time, it required a garrison of 10 to 12,000 soldiers. So right there, knock that off the forces that you have at your disposal. Some are going to get sick. Some are going to be dispersed to smaller garrisons and outposts. Doesn't leave a lot of men to conquer all that land, does it? And the problem was, anywhere the British Army went, immediately returned to the Crown. But the minute they left, these gentlemen showed up and made sure everybody was loyal to the Patriot cause, whether you were or not. And if you weren't, consequences to you. You'd be tarred and feathered, your house would be burned, you'd be run out. You guys aren't very nice.
No.
Other questions? Any questions for our American friends here?
I have a question. How did you overcome the deficit with the smooth bore rifles and their obvious more modern equipment?
Well, so at the beginning of the conflict, we actually still had muskets in the colonies as well. So in Pennsylvania, there were armories that held muskets. The problem was, as militia, we weren't trained. You know, we, as I said earlier, we cut our teeth on the fighting the savages on the frontier. So Indian-style warfare, Indian-style tactics, just getting out of there to stay alive. It wasn't until von Steuben at Valley Forge taught the entire army how to fight and how to, you know, trained us more so the Continental than the militia. But it took some time. Our tactics, as you saw, lived to fight another day. You know, they could have the field, they win the battle, we'll win the war in the end.
So to answer that question a little bit further, so George Washington, again, what army did he want to belong to in the previous war? The English, right? So he knew those tactics, right? He also knew frontier tactics. He served a long time on the frontier fighting the Indians as well. But he knew the tactics of the British Army. He served with them for a couple of years, both in Braddock's expedition and the Forbes expedition. So as the war went on, an interesting phenomena took place, and it often takes place in warfare, where your army, as the longer the war goes on, starts looking like the enemy that you're fighting, right? So that's exactly what Washington wanted. He wanted a professional, standing army. Who didn't want that? Who didn't want to pay for that? The Congress, right? They didn't have the power to tax back then. and everybody was afraid of a standing army because of English history. So they would give him somewhat of a standing army, but not a complete one. So he had to rely a lot on militia units to supplement his corps of Continental soldiers. And again, as the war went on, it became more of a professional American army. The officers received pensions, they received land grants, there were bounties paid for the men to join, there were pensions for them when they retired, the duration, so on and on and on. It looked more and more like the British Army by the end. You know, takes one to know one sort of thing. That's what they needed to fight a professional army. So he kind of sort of got his way, never completely, but they carried muskets, the majority of them carried muskets and fought using the same tactics that the English did.
Part of the other problem, what's happening right about now in farms across America? Harvesting. We're farmers. You know, we have crops back home that need to be harvested and brought in. Otherwise, our families won't survive the winter. And so the longer this conflict goes on, you know, when everything started with Lexington and Concord and the siege of Boston, it looked pretty, everybody was pretty excited that it looked like this was going to resolve itself pretty quickly. But the longer it went on, we didn't really have a whole lot of patience for that as militia. You know, we had to get back home, and the frontier warfare that was going on also sort of pulled people back from the main battles.
So you know how long the war went? What was the first year the fighting started in Boston, outside of Boston? 1775. Battle of Yorktown was what year? 1781. The war went on 2 more years after that. Went until 1783 before the British withdrew and a peace treaty was signed. That's a long war, an expensive one. Congress was still paying the debts off of this war into the 1840s, paying the survivors of the families or the sons and daughters of the people who had filed claims. So, yep, they were slow paying back then too.
Some of the generals pay their men out of their private funds, like I know everyone's saying the Marine did.
Right, so the question is, did some of the generals pay for the, yes, actually on both sides. Some of the generals on both sides paid for the funds. So in the British Army, the colonel virtually owned the regiment. Okay, in the British Army, the colonel of a regiment would be given a set amount of money, and he had to clothe and feed the men and whatnot. So he was responsible for that. Some of the wealthier ones, such as Lord Cornwallis, paid additional money out of his pocket. His regiment is actually regarded as the finest regiment in the British Army, even better than the Guards. So in the American side, yes, at times they did. There was a chap that led an expedition up to Canada. Does anybody know his name? General Benedict? Right, and Arnold spent a lot of his personal fortune financing that. Guess who wouldn't repay him because they said it wasn't authorized? Continental Congress. So how do you think he felt about that? Well, we know, right?
He joined your side.
Right. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes, and Nathaniel Greene also paid a lot of money out of his pocket, and again, it was refused. I think his heirs were finally paid off in the 1830s or 40s. Imagine that, huh? Actually, it's amazing how many of the Continental leaders ended up in debtor's prison or flat broke later on in their life. All right, well, if there's no other questions, or if you'd like to talk to us a bit further, we'd like...
Question.
Yes, sir.
You know, what strikes me is that I understand why these men are fighting, and you have some loyalty to the crown, but you're a long way from home, your families back in England, your children, your businesses, wherever they came from previously. Was public opinion in England against you? Was everybody for the fight over here? I know you're leaving in thousands of dead soldiers here. They're not going home. Word had to be getting back to England that sometimes, particularly towards the end, it started to turn not so well in a little town called Yorktown before it ended up there.
So the war was never particularly popular back in England. Of course, the glory for England was always fighting France or Spain or one of the other continental powers for an empire. So the English army had a hard time getting recruits to join their ranks during this conflict. So eventually they had to resort to drafts. They pressed different parishes. A lot of the society back then was run out of the local churches, the Church of England. So any unemployment men were swept into the ranks. Then eventually they had to start drafting, and there were riots in England over that called the Gordon Drafts. But once France and Spain and Holland got into it, then the war took on a different flavor, and the home front was very much threatened. So it was not particularly and put another spin on that. There were two major parties that competed for power in England. You had the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories were very much in favor of prosecuting the war. The Whigs were not, right? Many of the American patriots were also called Whigs because of that. Well, the general, at least for the first 2 years of the war of the British Army, General Howe, guess what he was? He was a Whig. So was his brother. They were also the chief peace commissioners as well as commanding the Army and the Navy. Talk about wearing two conflicting hats at once, right? So it was like a family fight. And the idea was to bring the people back into the fold, and they did not want to be too hard on them, right? Because we were all going to have to get along afterwards, even though it took about 100 years for that to happen. All right, so what we would like to do is invite you into our camps. We have the lovely Robin back there. Robin is going to do a presentation on the women who followed the Army, the camp followers of the Army. There are quite a few women in the Army, in both armies, and actually the armies couldn't function without them. So please, come over to our camp and we'll see you there. Thank you. Oh yeah, keep it going on. Yeah, I'll find it. I got another one. Thank you. All right, Corporal, take them back in.